Coach Wooden's note card. Game changer number 5. Number 5, make friendship a fine art. Now, I'd love to ask this question of myself and also of people all the time. And it's such a simple question. It's a reality question. It's a confront reality as it is, not as you wish it were. And here's the question. 0 to 10. 0 is absolutely never, non-existent. And 10 is consistently world class. How are you really doing with this one? Make friendship a fine art. Now, sometimes that question, that 0 to 10 question, sometimes we have to dive in or narrow the question and say, just pick one person in your life. Maybe it's somebody very, very close to you. Maybe it's one of your family members. Maybe it's one of your siblings, a brother or a sister. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's one of your kids. Maybe it's one of your parents. But how are you really doing? Not how are they doing. How are you really doing with making that relationship, making friendship in that relationship a fine art? See, Coach Wooden had deep, lasting friendships with so many of his players, and they all said it changed over time. It certainly transitioned, a major transition, when they went from being a player of his to after they finished playing for him. But one of his players, Sven Nader, put it this way. And Sven Nader, I think he played a few minutes total in his career at UCLA. He never started a game. Never started a single game in his whole college career. He would go on to lead the NBA in rebounding. And this is a guy who never started a game in college. Why not? Because his job in college was to develop Bill Walton. He played behind Bill Walton, who was All-American, probably maybe the best player in college basketball at the time. And Sven Nader's job was just develop him in practice, right? And Sven Nader wrote a book, brilliant book, from one of the lessons he learned from Coach Wooden. And the book is essentially, if they didn't learn it, you didn't teach it. I think he titled the book, You Haven't Taught Until They Have Learned. And see, Sven Nader, he said Wooden had a different perspective on relationships than most people. He said he wouldn't tell you, I'll treat you all the same. He said, I'll treat you based on what you earn and deserve. Individually, I'll treat you based on what you earn and deserve. And Sven Nader, he had a great poem that he wrote. And I want to read that poem to you. He said, you haven't made a fire until it has burned. You haven't made $1 till it's earned. And no teaching has transpired if the child has not acquired. You haven't taught a child until he's learned. But the most important point I want to make from Sven Nader's career under Coach Wooden and relationship with Coach Wooden is that Coach Wooden taught him over and over and over, and eventually Sven got it, that relationships are the ends, not the means. Make friendship a fine art. That means essentially your relationship with one of your kids, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with a coworker, your relationship with somebody that works for you, your relationship with a boss, your relationship with a client. If you're following John Wooden's guidance, that relationship is the point. It's not the means to an end. It is the end. It is the point. It is the reason. And maybe you develop some business with that client or person. Maybe not. But the relationship is the point. Wow. When you put it in that perspective, all of a sudden we say, well, making friendship a fine art, 0 to 10. Maybe you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking. I'm not as close to a 10 in any of my relationships. John Wooden often said that leadership is really just, it's sort of a borrowed cousin to parenting. And he considered the relationship of spouses to be incredibly, incredibly important. His wife, Nellie, she got sick and she passed away on the 21st of March in 1985. And John Wooden missed her terribly, and he, you see, they had they had a special relationship, but it wasn't accidental. It didn't just happen. They both put a massive amount of effort into it. And in one of their worst arguments as a couple, John Wooden actually left the house angry because he needed to cool off. He left the house angry. And when he got back home, his wife had written a little note and left it on his pillow. And it said, "Don't try to understand me. Just love me." And well, Nellie passes away March 21st, 1985. And John Wooden sat down and he wrote his wife a love letter that day and told her everything he thought of her and how much he missed her. And then on April 21st, a month later, John Wooden sat down and wrote a love letter to his wife. And then on May 21st of 1985, and then on June 21st, and then July, and then August, and then September, then October, then November, and December. And on the 21st of every single month, for the rest of John Wooden's life, John Wooden sat down and wrote a love letter to his wife. And he folded those love letters up and he tied them with a yellow ribbon and he put them on the bed where his wife Nellie used to sleep. And he would always sleep, for the rest of his life, he would sleep on his side of the bed. And her side had this stack, the ever-growing, once a month, increasing by one, stack of love letters. And when John Wooden passed away, the stack of letters was there, 300 letters high. And on the top of that stack was a little note. It was the note that Nellie had written John decades earlier. "Don't try to understand me. Just love me. Make friendship a fine art." See, I'm not a 10, you're not a 10. Probably not in any relationship in our lives. But here's the challenge. The challenge is not necessarily to measure yourself against John Wooden. The challenge is to measure yourself against how you were yesterday, how you were last week, how you were last year. And maybe pick one person in your life and say, "You know what? If I did this, if I asked this question, if I sent them this comment, if I gave them this, little note of appreciation, it would make a difference. It would get me a little bit closer to making friendship a fine art." Pat Williams, one of my favorite authors, he says, "Don't save your eulogies for your friends' funerals. Tell the people in your life what they mean and how important they are. Make friendship a fine art." See, if I looked in your calendar, I would know what really matters to you, wouldn't I? If you look in my calendar, and maybe not future calendar, but past calendar, what did you do? How did you spend your time? How did you use your time in the last week? It would tell me. It would scream loudly, wouldn't it? Here's a person. Here's a person who makes friendship a fine art. Or it would scream, no, this person does not make friendship a fine art. Maybe you really make time for certain things, but other things not so well. Make friendship a fine art. One of John Wooden's mentors, invisible mentors, was Abraham Lincoln. He had, I think, about 100 books written about Abraham Lincoln in his little condo when he passed away. And those were the books that he thought were worth reading and rereading and highlighting and making notes in the margins and remembering things from. And John Wooden would often remember things about Lincoln's life that challenged him. He said they rocked him to the core. They shook him to the core when he read about them, thought about them, tried to live up to them. And one of them was this. Towards the end of the war, the Civil War, Lincoln was pardoning many, many soldiers. And one of the pardons that came across his desk had not a single reference from a friend. You see, they'd come with this pardon, and the pardon letter would include references from friends who could vouch for the person's character. And this letter had no references at all. And Lincoln looked at one of his aides and he said, "Has this man no friends? Then I will be his friend." And he signed the pardon. And that got John Wooden thinking. It challenged him. It rocked him to the core. Make friendship a fine art. What do you think might happen? What do you think might happen if you took that one little note of the seven principles, of these 7 tenets, of these 7 game changers on that tiny note card that John Wooden would read day after day? If you took just this one, a little more seriously, maybe today, maybe this week, maybe for an entire month, do you think we could even come close to measuring the ripple effect of that? Make friendship a fine art. Thanks for the chance to be a part of your journey.